So this is Bant Company. No, not standard Bant Company, the deck we're all getting bored of, but taking Collected Company out of standard and moving it to modern. We've seen Abzan combo Collected Company. We've seen elf decks play Collected Company. What we haven't seen too much of in modern is simply mid-range Collected Company decks, and this Bant deck is just that. So we're just playing a lot of the good Bant creatures. Some of them are not at all staples of the modern format, but they're kind of carryovers from what works in the standard Collected Company deck, and then others are just good cards in modern, so it's a combination of different elements. The mana base has got a couple of funky lands in it, but primarily you just want to have a green source on turn 1 to cast your Noble Hierarch, but there's also 2 Celestial Colonnades and 2 Gavany Townships as essentially your value lands, your lands that are just a bit more than only mana producers. There's a bunch of fetch lands, which really help with some of the cards in the deck. There's also 3 copies of Razorverge Thicket, and it's nice to have a land that you can make multiple of your colors, and it comes into play untapped. But of course, we've got new lands coming out in Kaladesh that are very similar to the Razorverge Thicket cycle. But yeah, pretty happy with the mana base. Sometimes it's a little awkward, but most of the time it's pretty consistent. There's 23 lands, 4 Noble Hierarchs, so you actually have your 27 mana sources, and Noble Hierarch is perfect here. You can find it off Collected Company. It allows you to play less lands, and it produces all of your colors in the deck. So Noble Hierarch, no stranger to modern at all. Very good card in a lot of modern decks at the moment. Then we've also, at our 1 mana slot, there's some removal spells. 4 copies of Path to Exile. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. But then there's also 1 Sunlance. Sunlance is basically the 5th removal spell in the deck. It deals with most creatures in the format, destroying or dealing 3 damage to a non-white creature. And then it's also a sorcery, which is nice because we're playing 4 copies of Tarmogoyf, so we want to have a variety of different types of spells if possible. So yeah, like I mentioned, 4 copies of Tarmogoyf. Even though we aren't going to get a ton of different types of card types in our graveyard that easily, Tarmogoyf is still one of the best creatures. There's some matchups where you find 2 off of a Collected Company. It's just like, oh my god, that's absurd. And then there's other times where it's just like a 2 mana 1/2 for a couple turns, and it's not that great. So it goes both ways, but definitely one of the more powerful cards in the format. Spellskite does a lot for the deck. First of all, it's an artifact, so if it goes to the graveyard, it can help your Goyf. But it basically helps protect the creatures you really want to protect. So we've got some 3 mana cards that we don't want to be removed from play, specifically Spell Queller. But in general, Spellskite is just good right now. There's a bunch of decks like that. This deck, this card completely shuts down. Like Infect, we know. Okay, you play Spellskite, if they don't kill it, Infect just doesn't have a chance, basically. But then you also have decks like Death Shadow, where you play a Spellskite and all of their pump spells become useless. So there's multiple decks in the format where this card is great, and then alternatively it just eats a removal spell. So yep, there's actually 3 copies in the main deck here. And the last 2 drop in the deck is our Graveyard Interaction. Scavenging Ooze is just a good card. Wouldn't play more than 2, but pretty happy when the dust settles to have a Scavenging Ooze that you can play, gain some life, and just make a big dude that is capable of closing out the game. But our 3-mana creature slot is really the meat and potatoes of this deck. There's a bunch of different 3-mana creatures because they are the most powerful creatures in the deck and the cards you really want to find off of Collected Company. So we've got 4 copies of Reflector Mage. Reflector Mage is just good. It's a way of interacting with your opponent's creatures, and the effect is pretty powerful. You can play it on turn 2. So if your opponent just goes, whatever creature, say it's a Dark Confidant, doesn't matter, you bounce it, and then it's just a huge tempo play. And yeah, your opponent's not going to see it coming in Modern, and it's still good here. Spell Queller is also a nice way of interacting with what your opponent's doing. You can clearly hit it off of a Collected Company. You can protect it with Spell Queller. It's also a flying creature or flying blocker in some situations, and been pretty happy with it. Then we've got Vendilion Click. Vendilion Click is another card that's great against the combo decks as a card you can company into, disrupt your opponent's hand. You can target yourself with it in a pinch, and we don't want to play too many of them because they are legendary, but there is another copy in the board. And then we've got our value creatures. So these are the cards that help you have a really nice late game. You can draw cards, get card advantage, basically. So 2 copies of Eternal Witness. You cast a Collected Company, you put an Eternal Witness into play, you can then put in another creature off the company and then get your Collected Company back. So you can basically just continue the Collected Company chain as you find a witness, get your company back, or you can get something else back. But it just allows you to keep having gas, essentially. And then Tireless Tracker is a card that pretty big fan of in Modern just because of all of the fetch lands, and this deck plays a bunch of fetch lands. So just playing a Tireless Tracker, playing a fetch, you all of a sudden have gotten a lot of card advantage. You can company into it, of course, and yeah, it's been pretty nice in the deck. Also at carryover from the standard Bant Company deck. Then we've got Restoration Angel. So Restoration Angel, it's great with cards like any sort of comes into play effect. It's clearly really nice with. So Eternal Witness, Vendilion Click, Reflector Mage, those are the types of cards where you can flicker them out with your Restoration Angel and just get even more value out of them. And Restoration Angel is just a good card. We see it in some Modern decks, but it should be seeing more play than it is. And then we've also at the 4-mana slot, we've got, of course, the 4 Collected Companies. So this is the list. I've been working on it for a little while. Was actually pretty close to playing this deck at Worlds. And here's the sideboard. So we've got a bunch of different types of interaction on our board. There's going to be some matchups that are pretty difficult to win game 1. And then we have to look at our board for help. So like the graveyard decks, and if we're not drawing Scavenging Ooze game 1, we're definitely a dog. We've got Rest in Peace to help shore that up. Meddling Mage is great against, there's a lot of combo decks in the format right now, and Meddling Mage is a card you can company into. You can protect it with Spellskite. So I actually been really impressed with this card against a lot of the matchups. Comes in a lot. Like any deck that's trying to combo you out, you're bringing a Meddling Mage instantly. Negate, similarly, it's good against any sort of combo deck or big mana non-creature deck or even control deck. Stony Silence, we know what that's for. It's of course for affinity. Do need a little bit of help in that matchup after game 1. So there's also 2 Reclamation Sages, not only against Affinity, but also against decks like Boggles and enchantment-based decks. And Reclamation Sage, you can, unlike Stony Silence, you can find it off of Collected Company, and it'll come in random spots that you wouldn't even think it would be boarded in for those matchups. You would think that there'd be more Kitchen Finks in the deck, but actually the aggressive matchups are pretty good for this deck, so you don't need that much life gain. Kitchen Finks is a very strong card that you can company into, and if you're worried about burn, you can definitely play more on the board, but right now there's only one. And then one Vendilion Click, one Intrepid Hero. So this is another card you can company into. It's nice against particularly Bant Eldrazi. It can shoot down Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher, Drowner. And it can have a high impact on the game there. It's not a card that sees very much play at all, but I am playing one copy in the board. Similarly, Aven Mind Sensor is good against a deck that's searching your deck. So a deck like, say, Scapeshift. You're not going to want to cast a Scapeshift with an Aven Mind Sensor in play, I can tell you that much. So the card can be very high impact, and there's a lot of high impact 1-ofs for specific matchups, and I like that in my mid-range decks to have a bunch of different 1-ofs and 2-ofs in the board. So there's also one copy of Sower Temptation. Comes in basically against any creature-based deck without much removal. Can be very powerful. And then Worship is another way to just steal a win if your opponent isn't putting you on it or doesn't have a way of dealing you damage. Basically, Worship can steal games against decks that are unprepared for it. We already know that. And this is the sideboard. This is the deck. Pretty interesting deck, if I do say so. And looking forward to playing with it here.